much more likely to use wind power on a household or neighborhood or district basis than to build these deployments of Godzilla-sized turbines in gigantic wind farms. The key to understanding what we face is that we have to comprehensively make other arrangements for all the normal activities of everyday life. It's a very long and detailed to-do list. The public discussion of these issues is impressively incoherent. The failure of the collective imagination is reflected especially in the poor job being done by the mainstream media covering this story, especially in particular the New York Times, which does little besides publish feel-good press releases from Cambridge Energy Research Associates, the oil industry's chief public relations office. These days, the only aspect of these issues that we are willing to talk about at all is how we're going to keep running the cars by other means. And we have to get beyond this obsession with how we're going to run the cars, because the future is not just going to be about motoring. We have to make these comprehensive arrangements for all the other activities of daily life. We have to grow our food differently. We have to do farming differently, because the industrial model, the Archer-Daniel Midland, Monsanto, and Cargill model of agribusiness will not survive the discontinuities of the long emergency. This system of pouring oil and gas-based fertilizers on the soil in order to grow the cheese doodles and the hamburgers. As oil and gas deplete, we will be left with sterile soils and farming organized at an unworkable scale. And many lives will depend on our ability to fix this. We're going to find out by the hard way that we can't afford to dedicate our croplands to growing grains and soybeans for motor fuels. And a Pennsylvania farmer put it to me eloquently about 3 weeks ago when he said, "It looks like we're going to take the last 6 inches of Midwest topsoil and burn it up in our gas tanks." The disruptions of the ethanol mania are already thundering through our system. Last month, there were riots in the center of Mexico City because so much Mexican corn is now being diverted to ethanol production in the U.S., and the poor people living on the economic margins can't afford to pay for their staple foods of corn and tortillas, etc. And so you can see, by the way, how this is a tragic extension of our obsession with running all the cars. In the years ahead, farming is going to come back closer to the center of economic life. It will necessarily be done at a more local and smaller scale. And it presents huge problems for us in land reform. Okay, another thing. We're going to have to move people around from place to place differently. It's imperative that we restore the U.S. passenger railroad system. No other project we could do right away would have a more positive impact on our oil consumption. We used to have a railroad system that was the envy of the world, and now we have a railroad system that the Bulgarians would be ashamed of. The infrastructure for rebuilding our railroads for this great task is lying out there, rusting in the rain, waiting to be fixed. The project would put back to work scores of thousands of people in meaningful jobs at every level, from labor to management. It would benefit people in all ranks of society, and fixing the U.S. Passenger rail system doesn't require any technological leaps into the unknown. The technology is thoroughly understood. The fact that from end to end of the political spectrum, there's no public discussion about fixing the U.S. passenger rail system shows how unserious we are. It's very, very important to get to this task. And there's another compelling reason to undertake this great project of repairing the U.S. passenger rail system. It's something that would restore our confidence, a way that we could demonstrate to ourselves that we're competent, that we're capable, that we're realistic, that we can meet the challenges of this energy-scarce future. And it will inspire us to get on with the other things that we have to do. And by the way, it's terribly important that we electrify this system. All the other advanced nations have electric railroad systems, which you can run on other things. You can control the source point, carbon emissions, and so forth. Terribly important. We're going to have to move things by boat. But we've just finished a 50-year effort of taking apart most of the infrastructure for maritime trade in this country, because we've gotten the idea that harbors and riverfronts are only for parks and bike trails and condo sites and festival marketplaces and rock and roll band shells. we're going to have to put back the piers and the warehouses and even the crummy accommodations for the sailors. And we're going to have to move a lot more stuff by water, or our commerce will suffer. And if we use trucks at all, we're probably going to use them in the final increment of the journey, if we use them at all. And our leaders in business and politics have not yet wrapped their minds around that new reality. We are probably in the twilight of happy motoring, as we've known it. The automobile is going to be a diminished presence in our life. They may not disappear, but it will become self-evident that our extreme dependency is at an end, and it will then become a political problem, because as a larger and larger class of people cannot afford happy motoring, they're going to be full of resentment and grievance about it, and especially about maintaining and fixing highways that only an elite can enjoy. We're going to have to make other arrangements for commerce and manufacturing. The national chain discount stores that took over American retail in recent decades are not going to survive the discontinuities of the long emergency. Their business equations and methods of operation will fail. In particular, their remorseless cancer-like drive toward replication and expansion. They will lack the resilience to adapt due to their gigantic scale of operations and narrow profit margins. The so-called warehouse on wheels, composed of thousands of trucks circulating incessantly around the interstate highways, won't work in an economy of ever scarcer and more expensive oil. Not to mention the 12,000-mile supply lines to the factories of Asia, which we have tragically become dependent on for all our household goods. We're going to have to check all our assumptions at the door about the global economy. Now, thanks to Tom Friedman and other cheerleaders, we've adopted the idea that globalism is a permanent condition of life. I think we'll be disappointed to learn the truth, that globalism was a set of transient economic relations that were possible at a particular time of special conditions in the world, namely half a century of cheap energy and of relative peace between the great powers. And those conditions are about to end. And many of our far-flung economic relations that we've come to rely on will go with them. The U.S. and China are contesting for the world's remaining oil resources. China has outstripped its own dwindling supply. China has gone all over the world in recent years, systematically making contracts for future delivery of oil with other nations, including Canada, by the way, as it ramps up the tar sand production. And I want to remind you that there's such a thing as the Monroe Doctrine, an American foreign policy position that essentially forbids nations outside the Western Hemisphere from intruding in or exploiting affairs in this part of the world. And it may be an old and arrogant policy, but I predict the time will come when the United States will invoke it in order to preserve our access to Canadian oil supplies. And if and when that occurs, what do you suppose that will mean to our trade relations with China? How many plastic wading pools and salad shooters will Walmart be ordering then? We're going to have to rebuild our own retail trade and commerce and manufacturing in this country. And it's important to recognize the damage that the national discount chain stores have already done in destroying local commercial economies. If you travel around the nation as I do, you see places in Pennsylvania and Alabama and Michigan and Oklahoma and Connecticut and my own home place of the Upper Hudson Valley, places that now look like former Soviet backwaters. They've become so destitute and deindustrialized. The desolation is just out of this world. In destroying local retail infrastructures, the chain stores wiped out a whole merchant middle class. These were the people who sat on local school boards and hospital boards and sponsored Little League baseball, who employed their neighbors and had to behave decently toward them because they had to live with them, and they had to treat their neighbors decently in matters of trade because they had to live with them. And there were people who uniformly took care of at least two buildings in their town, the place they did business and the place they lived in. And these were the people who were the caretakers of our communities, and the extermination of this class of citizens has been devastating. I think the truth is we're going to have fewer things to buy in the years ahead. The blue light special orgy of retail is going to fade into history, and shopping will retreat into the background of life. Consuming things will not be our sole reason for living. The role of finance as we know it today will be severely challenged by the long emergency. Declining energy supplies will have one particularly grave implication for industrial societies. that they can no longer take for granted the 3 to 7% annual growth in gross domestic product that has been